Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the world of aristocratic confusions, the tangled, bloated, and sometimes hilariously absurd titles of European nobles. Imagine this. You walk into a grand medieval hall lit by flickering torchlight, expecting to meet the Duke. Simple enough, right? Except he turns out to be not just a Duke, but also the Elector Palatine of the Rhine Archsteward of the Holy Roman Empire, Count of Simmarn, and bizarrely Lord Protector of some long-lost forest that technically doesn't exist anymore. He nods politely as you fumble over which title to bow to first. You probably won't survive this banquet of bureaucracy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little history corner reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a candlelit court where every title sounds like it was invented by someone trying to win a Scrabble championship. It's easy to imagine that being a noble in medieval Europe was a fairly straightforward gig. Inherit land, wear expensive boots, maybe attend a few sword duels before brunch. But no, things were never that simple. Titles were everything, and no self-respecting noble was content with just one. Meet Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, though that's just his starter title. He was also briefly the King of Bohemia, a count several times over, and through marriage got tangled in claims to lands he'd never even seen. His official correspondence was so jammed with layered titles that reading one aloud felt more like a medieval rap battle than a royal decree. But the real kicker, half of those titles didn't come with any actual power. They were honorary, hereditary, or completely symbolic. It's like giving someone a VIP badge that doesn't open any doors, just makes them look fancier. Historians still argue whether these elaborate titles reflected real political strength, or were just the result of centuries of insecure nobles trying to one-up each other. And while many titles did represent legal authority over land or people, others were what you might call aspirational. You walk past a tapestry of a nobleman whose official designation is something like His Serene Highness, Duke of Swabia, Margrave of Meissen, Count Palatine of the Rhine, Defender of the Faith, Bearer of the Imperial Sword, and Grand Falconer of the Empire. All this, and the poor guy probably couldn't even collect taxes without permission from someone 3 ranks lower. But the titles meant more than power. They were legacy, proof of ancestry, tokens of ambition, and sometimes just really good PR. There's a story about a minor noble in Bavaria who, having no land and no vassals, styled himself protector of the upper lakes. Those lakes, they were technically puddles behind his estate, but the title stuck because no one challenged it. That's the thing. These titles often went unchallenged because no one could even keep track. By the late medieval period, a noble might inherit 10 different names and 5 coats of arms, all mashed together like a family history smoothie. And if you think this sounds confusing, wait until you add in marriages. A single union between 2 noble houses could generate a whole new chain of titles for the resulting offspring, whether they inherited the land or not. In some courts, it became a matter of social survival. To accumulate as many titles as possible, it wasn't about what you ruled, but how many impressive syllables you could stack before your name. There is even evidence of nobles commissioning scribes to reconstruct family titles from supposed Roman or mythical origins. You might meet a man claiming descent from Achilles, the Duke of Troy, Count of Olympus, and Guardian of the Sacred Torch. None of it real, all of it absurd. But if it got him a seat at the king's table, worth it. One particularly sleep-inducing example comes from 17th century Austria. An actual nobleman there had 43 documented titles. The list took up an entire page of official documents. Even the emperor was said to have rolled his eyes at the length. Meanwhile, you're just trying to remember where you put your socks this morning. Quirky moments like this make the noble class feel oddly familiar, because isn't it a bit like modern business cards? Regional Vice President of Strategic Forward Planning and Vision Development. Sounds fancy. Means what, exactly? Back in the medieval courts, these flourishes did serve a function sort of. They helped distinguish branches of noble families, confirmed succession rights, and signaled loyalty or rank within larger systems, like the Holy Roman Empire. Still, the line between legitimacy and pure ego inflation was always thin. Picture yourself at court, trying to address someone, "Good evening, my lord, our highness, your grace, most noble elector," and getting it wrong could cost you dearly. Misuse a title and you might lose favor, or worse, get challenged to a duel over dinner. Eventually, courts had to hire experts, literally, people whose job was to track and rank titles. It was like being a human spreadsheet. So, next time you hear the word duke or count, know that beneath that single term may lie centuries of ambition, paperwork, and a whole lot of confusion. Because, in the noble world, your title wasn't just who you were, it was how loud your ancestors could shout from beyond the grave. And yes, there was always that one guy who insisted on being called most noble and illustrious lord of all the western winds. You can't make this stuff up. Except apparently you can. You haven't even finished wrapping your head around that Elector Palatine Duke something from earlier. And now you re-ushered into a grand banquet hall where half the attendees respond to Baron. You squint at the name cards on the enormous linen drip table. Baron von this, Baron D that, Freiherr of some place you've never heard of. It's like you've stumbled into a noble version of a corporate team-building dinner, and everyone's job title is manager, except some of them secretly own the building, and others just manage their cousin's goose farm. The word Baron should be easy. Short, punchy, vaguely but of course, it wasn't. Barons came in flavors, and across Europe, that flavor changed depending on the local recipe. In England, a baron was the lowest rank of the peerage, but still part of the House of Lords. In Germany, the term Freiherr, technically, a baron could describe a man who held land directly from the emperor or someone whose family had convinced the right bureaucrat to scribble von in front of their last name during the 19th century. Historians still argue whether all baronial titles came with land rights or just ceremonial prestige. Some definitely included territorial authority, others were like being knighted with a fancier nameplate. You overhear a conversation between two barons, each speaking in a different language, each secretly thinking the other is beneath them. One of them casually mentions he controls 3 villages. The other owns a dilapidated tower in the Alps and a symbolic vineyard that Hazen Tea produced wine since the Black Plague. But he's the one wearing real velvet. So, who's more powerful? And don't even ask about the wives. If a woman married a baron in one country, she might become a baroness. But in another, she'd need her own bloodline of nobility to hold. The same Tidderland could be referred to by a completely different rank altogether. There's a story, probably exaggerated, but charming, about a banquet in Vienna, where 6 barons got into a heated debate over whose title had the older charter. One baron stormed out after realizing his family's barony was created in the 15th century, not the 14th, as he'd always believed. The insult unforgivable. Then of course, you have courtesy barons. Now that sounds polite, maybe someone who holds the door open at noble assembly, but no, it just means a person. usually the eldest son of a higher-ranking noble, who uses a lesser title until he inherits the big one. So, a baron, who was actually a placeholder earl. This whole time, you tried to follow the order of seating around the table because, yes, even that was dictated by title. The highest-ranking noble had the chair closest to the host. Then down the line, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons, except sometimes a lesser noble with ancient blood could outrank a newer noble with a shinier title, or one region recognized a title that another completely ignored. A Dutch baron could be considered higher ranking than an Italian count in some circles and totally irrelevant in others. Imagine getting demoted mid. Even the title of baron itself had no fixed spelling or pronunciation. In France, baron. In Italy, in the Ottoman Empire, no such title existed, so they just sort of guessed when translating European rank. And in Hungary, barons had an extra prestige layer known as magnates, if they belonged to the higher nobility. You're beginning to realize how this chaos wasn't an accident, it was designed by tradition. Centuries of ego-building and regional tweaking turned noble titles into a kind of self-replicating maze. Everyone wanted their family to seem slightly more important than the next, so they layered, added, embellished, and that led to the most noble of all noble pastimes: title inflation. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to be Baron of Wind, but a flair for drama, styled himself Baron of the Eclipsed Moon. You needed to be Baron of Windmere and hereditary keeper of the Westgate Bridge. Add a ceremonial role. Great. Invent an old family story, where your great-grandfather once spoke to a king. Even better. There's even a delightful fringe tidbit about a baron in Transylvania who, having absolutely no land, no one knew what that meant. But he had a signet ring and a cloak, so people just went with it. Sometimes these titles were bestowed for service. The Habsburg emperors, for instance, handed out baronetcies like thank you cards. You've built a bridge, loaned the empire money, or provided 30 horses for the army. Boom, you're a baron now. You also get a new coat of arms featuring 2 raccoons holding swords. But just as often, Berenis were bought, particularly in places like Italy or later Spain, where noble houses found themselves short on heirs or cash. Sell the title, keep the castle, and boom. Some ambitious merchant becomes a baron with a suspiciously recent crest. By now, you're half asleep at the banquet, head tilted toward a golden goblet as 2 barons next to you whisper about whether one of them is secretly descended from Charlemagne. Spoiler, what makes all this even more confusing is how titles stuck around, even after they lost all political meaning. By the 19th century, most barons had no armies, no land, and no legislative power. But that didn't stop them from putting it on their business cards, or monogramming it onto their cutlery. It was all about perception. You might be broke, but if you're broke with a title, you still get invited to the right kind of parties. You stifle a yawn as a court musician plucks at a lute, and a bored baroness explains that her family were once marsh barons, whatever that means, probably ruled over a swamp. Still sounds kind of cool. And you start to get it. All this ridiculous complexity, this petty comparison of who got which seated wasn't just bureaucracy. It was theatre, a performance of power long after the curtain had dropped. And as silly as it seems now, it worked. You remember the man called Baron of 3 Rivers and Keeper of the Sapphire Seal a lot longer than plain old Greg? You shuffle slowly through a marble-floored hallway lined with ancient tapestries, each one commemorating a victory you've never heard of by someone with a title you can pronounce. This is the Holy Roman Empire, where nobility wasn't just a status. It was a never-ending experiment in bureaucratic excess. And right now, you're standing at ground zero of title overload. Imagine a realm that wasn't really an empire, wasn't particularly holy, and wasn't even very Roman by the time it reached its most complicated stage, yet here it was, churning out titles like a medieval label maker on caffeine, Elector, Count Palatine, Margrave, Archchancellor. Some of these titles overlapped, some contradicted one another, and many were created simply to reward loyalty or, just as often, to keep rivals busy chasing status instead of real power. The emperor himself bore a mountain of titles: Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, Archduke of Austria, King of Bohemia, King of Hungary, Protector of the Faith, and Guardian of the Holy See. Honestly, you're surprised he had room for a signature on anything. Historians still argue whether the inflation of titles in the Holy Roman Empire served to decentralize authority deliberately, or whether it simply spiraled out of control under centuries of dynastic insecurity. You're inclined to believe both, because here titles were currency, and the empire minted plenty. At its peak, the Holy Roman Empire contained hundreds of semi-independent counties, bishoprics, free imperial cities, and ecclesiastical states. Each lord, abbot, or mayor wanted recognition, so the imperial chancellery responded with a flurry of official documents. Imperial Knight of the Order of the Golden Spur, Count of the Swabian Marshes, Free Lord of the Upper Road, Imperial Burgrave of the Silver Valley. Some of these sound like they were invented during a long bath, but they were all quite real and jealously guarded. A classic example, the title Lector. Only 7 nobles, originally held it the elite few who had the right to elect the emperor. But over time, more electors were added, demoted, or fought over. At one point, there were 3 different rulers, all claiming to be the legitimate elector of Saxony. The job didn't come with much land or an army, but it did come with prestige and the occasional chance to leverage bribes from hopeful emperors. Then there were the prince. You walk past a stained glass window of one now, gold robes, jeweled staff, a mitre sitting precariously on his carefully oiled curls. These guys weren't just church leaders. They ruled territory, collected taxes, and went to war. They were both divine and temporal authorities, a 2-for-1 deal in ecclesiastical packaging. One such bishop, the Prince Bishop of Würzburg, was even elevated to Duke of Franconia, just to sweeten the title stew. So now you had a bishop who was also a duke and sometimes a count, depending on the occasion. You get the feeling that if he'd asked nicely, the Emperor might have thrown an official wine taster of the Danube too. Then there's the Reichsritter, the Imperial Knights. These were technically nobles, often without much land, but with an imperial charter confirming their status. They loved their titles. Knight of the White Wolf, Knight Captain of the Eastern Cross, Defender of the Ancient Right. Their actual military value, debatable. But their heraldic designs, absolute masterpieces of medieval overcompensation. A quirky example that keeps scholars entertained even today is the county of the left bank of the Rhine. Not a title in itself, but a territory broken into dozens of overlapping claims. At one point, 5 different nobles claimed the title of Count of the Rhine. One never even left Vienna. One was from Bavaria, one was French, and one was actually a woman who used a male version of the title because it sounded cooler. You're trying to make sense of all this and realize something. It wasn't just nobles adding to their names. The emperor himself played favorites, creating new titles to reward loyal allies or to dilute the power of rival houses. And sometimes, titles were granted with zero intent of actual leadership. A noble might be made Margrave of the Western Marshes, even though the Western Marshes had been annexed 100 years prior. But hey, it looked good on the family tombstone. You chuckle softly when you learn about one noble family that collected so many overlapping titles that they had to print their entire introduction on a fold-out scroll. A visiting French ambassador once reportedly said, "I came to speak with a man, and instead I met a paragraph. And when a title wasn't enough, the empire simply created a new rank, like Landgrave, technically a count, who ruled directly under the emperor, but mostly a workaround for nobles who didn't want to be called Count something or other, like everyone else." There's also the Burgrave, governor of a castle and surrounding town, not to be confused with Margrave, who oversaw, or Palgrave, who managed royal palaces or court affairs. At some point, you start to wonder if the empire had a noble version of a random word generator. Still, this hyper-fragmented mess served a purpose. It kept everyone vying for position, busy with etiquette, and reliant on imperial favor. By keeping his vassals tangled in status games, the emperor ensured his own central Rolovan, if his actual power was flimsy at best. You pass a stone doorway inscribed with no fewer than 8 coats of arms. None of them match. Apparently, they were all stitched together from marriages, inheritance claims, and one very confusing duel in a barley field. This is the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire. Not sweeping conquests or a unified identity, but an avalanche of titles, some meaningful, most gloriously useless. And yet, they worked. Because even a meaningless title gave you something to cling to when the world got chaotic. A name, a story, a piece of gold-threaded fabric declaring, "I matter." You wonder what title they'd give you. Sleepy Count of the Sagging Pillow, Margrave of the Left Side Blanket. Doesn't sound too bad, really. You ease into a silk-padded carriage, rattling gently along a cobbled path, flanked by hedges trimmed to geometric perfection. The year is something like 1715, and you're re-heading toward the gleaming heart of Europe's most elegant title machine. You may be tired, but you're about to witness a masterclass in how to turn noble titles into high-art high drama. The French nobility didn't just do titles, they performed them. You arrive at Versailles, a palace so enormous and gold-covered, it looks like it was designed by a peacock with a crown fetish. And everyone here has a title, or wants one. The nobility is divided into tiers nobilis depit, who earned their status through military service, and noblesse de robe, who bought or inherited civil offices. But Comte Durand, Marquis de Clairvaux, Signor de Belterra, and Chevalier of the Royal Order of the Holy Spirit, you barely cross the threshold before you're greeted corrected by a man who insists he's not simply Comte Durand. You nod politely while your brain takes a nap. Historians still argue whether these layers were intended to maintain social order or entrench competition so deeply that no noble ever had the time or clarity to rebel. You suspect the latter. The French obsession with rank bordered on spiritual. Nobles spent fortunes ensuring their family names were etched into the right registries, and that their daughters married into exactly the right level of prestige. And at the top of the pyramid, the princes, sang princes of the blood. These weren't just royals. They were a divine category of humans who believed they perspired more regally than the rest. Then came the dukes, et pairs dukes, who were also peers of the realm, meaning they had the right to sit in parliament and sneer at everyone else. Below that, marquis, conques, vicomtes, and barons each step a meticulously maintained rung on an invisible ladder. Each title came with ancient lineages, and sometimes utterly symbolic lands with names like St. Cloud's, which roughly translates to the cloudy nothing town. There's a fringe tidbit about a marquis who insisted his estate was founded by Merovingian kings, despite all records showing it was actually a goat pasture until about 1630. But if you repeat a lie with enough embroidery, it starts to feel legitimate. And unlike other countries, The French aristocracy often styled themselves with layers of inherited, ceremonial, or just aesthetically pleasing titles that had no legal standing whatsoever. It was all about presentation. A Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Louis. One nobleman had a name so long it required its own calling card case. Louis Charles Francois de Bourbon, Duc de Vendôme, Marquis de Normotor, Baron de Mondragon, Signor de la... By the time you finished introducing yourself, desert was over. And yes, there were etiquette books written just to explain who bowed to whom and how deeply. Imagine needing a flowchart to know if you could speak before sipping your soup. You wander past salons where powdered nobles debate poetry, and you overhear one deeply offended that someone referred to him as merely a count, when in fact he was a marquise. The difference: technically, a marquis oversaw borderlands marsh while a count ruled interior regions, but in practice, by the 18th century, most of these distinctions were ceremonial. Still, to the French noble eye, calling a marquis a count was like calling a Tesla a tricycle. Even royal mistresses got involved. Madame de Pompadour was made a marquise. Later, another mistress of the king demanded she be styled duchess instead. It became a romantic power move. My love is so profound, he gave me a And then came the noblesse de robe, the bureaucratic nobility. Lawyers, financiers, and tax officials who earned their way into the nobility. Yes, you could literally buy a title in France. Some officers came with annoblement after a number of years, and styled himself as Baron de Quittance or Baron of the Receipt. Others were attached to specific payments and could be inherited. It led to awkward dinner parties where sword nobles would scoff at robe nobles, who would then point out that their land revenues were double and their titles came with less inbreeding. There is even a curious story of a tax official who bought his way into a barony. Not exactly the height of chivalric romance, but the man knew bookkeeping like a knight knew battle. You begin to sense the nervous undercurrent here. Every title, no matter how fussy or ornamental, was a tool in a never-ending competition to prove legitimacy, heritage, and relevance, because if you didn't assert your titles, they might as well not exist. And as more and more new nobles emerged from financial or political circles, the old aristocracy doubled down on documentation, family trees, and public ceremony. That's why some nobles carried entire levers, de raison books tracing every ancestor who ever held a title, performed a service, or died poetically in a duel. These weren't just they were legal proof, social shields, sacred scrolls of snobbery. But then, the revolution came, and just like that, all those layers of powdered prestige came crashing down. Titles were abolished, heads rolled literally and symbolically. The nobility fled, disguised themselves, or rebranded as ordinary citizens. Still, many clung to their old styles, even in exile. A displaced duke sweeping chimneys in London would insist on being addressed properly. The French aristocracy didn't die so much as scatter and whisper its own stories back into the cracks of history. And eventually, with the restoration of the monarchy and the empire, titles began to return, though never with quite the same pageantry. You stretch your legs beneath a golden candelabra and think. Only in France could someone hold 5 titles and still spend most of their day fighting over who got the bigger wig stand. You're standing at the foot of a grand staircase, deep in some ivy-covered English country estate, and the butler has just introduced the lord of the house with a title. So long, you feel like you need to sit down halfway through hearing it. Welcome to Britain, land of tea, fox hunts, and the peerage system so tangled it could strangle you in your sleep. At first glance, the British system looks more organized than its continental cousins. 5 neat ranks of nobility: Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, Baron. Easy, right? Oh, sweet summer child. You try to remember the order: dukes at the top, obviously, then marquises, earls. Wait, is marquis just a fancy earl? And what's a You blink rapidly, realizing you've entered a world where pronunciation alone is a minefield. Marquis is not marquess, and viscount is not viscount. It's viscount, which sounds like a minor vampire. Historians still argue whether the British peerage structure created true social stability, or just froze the class system in place under layers of inherited velvet and powdered wigs. Either way, it worked. You get ushered into the drawing room by someone called Lady Something, who casually mentions that her husband is a marquis, but she's not a marchioness because she prefers the older Scottish style of title. Sure, that clears it right up. Let's start at the top. British dukes were the ultimate aristocrats, the highest rank outside the royal family. They held massive estates, parliamentary power, and centuries of intermarried influence. The Duke of Norfolk, for example, is not only England's premier duke, but also the Earl Marshal responsible for organizing royal coronations and funerals. You consider that, and wonder if he's ever double-booked himself for both in the same week. Marquises came next. Technically, a marquis governed a march, a border territory. But in England, that meaning faded fast. Soon, being a marquis just meant you were nobler than an earl, but not quite good enough to be a duke. There's a charmingly petty story about one marquis who petitioned the crown to be elevated to a dukedom purely because he couldn't tea-bear sitting below another peer at dinner. The crown said no, and the man reportedly sulked through the entire cheese course. Then come the earls. Earls are ancient, older than many of the other ranks, and proudly Anglo-Saxon in origin. In fact, earl is the only rank not borrowed from a continental word. Elsewhere in Europe, this role is filled by counts, which is why the wife of an earl is still called a countess, just to keep things spicy and inconsistent. Below the earl, you find the viscount. Viscounts came into British peerage relatively late, around the 15th century, and were mostly used to pad out the rankings. They rarely ruled large tracts of land, but they were often influential members of parliament or courtly insiders. One viscount famously boasted that he had influence over 6 boroughs and exactly 1 reliable butcher. You feel a kinship with that man. Meet in politics. What else does one need? And finally, the barons. Lowest in the ranking, but not necessarily in importance. Barons were often granted their titles for military service, loyalty, or royal favor. In early times, they held their seats directly from the king and were key players in the Magna Carta. By now, you've completely forgotten who's who at the gathering. Someone whispers, "That's Lord Pembroke." But technically, he's also Earl of Carnarvon and Marquis of Salisbury. You nod, understanding nothing, and sip tea with feigned sophistication. But here's where it gets delightfully British. Courtesy titles. Eldest sons of dukes and marquises often use one of their father's lesser titles. So, if your dad is a duke, and also an earl and a baron, you might be called Earl of something, even though you were not actually a peer yet. This and that at school that he tried to register under a fake name. It's like noble training wheels. There is even a story of a teenage heir to a dukedom who got so tired of being called Lord his fake name, George. Everyone still knew who he was. And yes, women got caught in this title web too. Some were born Lady So-and-so by birthright. Others married into titles, but if you married down, say, a countess marrying a knight, you lost the honor, unless the queen personally stepped in, which occasionally happened. especially if the woman was popular or had a good singing voice at court functions. One quirky tidbit involves Lady Hester Stanhope, who refused to drop her title after falling into political disgrace. She declared herself Queen of the East, and lived in the Middle East, dressed in male Bedouin robes. Honestly, 10/10 energy, and if you think titles stopped with peers, think again. There are baronets, who are sort of like hereditary knights. They're not peers, but they're above regular knights. They don't sit in the House of Lords, but they put Sir before their name and often have coats of arms featuring weasels jousting by the Victorian era. It was all getting a bit crowded. Queen Victoria created new titles to reward loyalty, scientific achievement, and colonial service. A duke here, a baron there if you mapped it out. It looked like a ladder made of pure ceremony. One historian once called the British peerage system a country estate built entirely of mirrors. Impressive from every angle, but easy to get lost in. You sit by the fire, flipping through a Debrett's peerage. Director essentially a noble phone book, the size of a brick. Each entry includes name, title, family motto, ancestral estates, and whether or not they supported the Glorious Revolution. Half of it reads like coded gossip, but perhaps the most British touch of all, the titles persist. Even today, dukes and earls walk among us. Some live in castles, some rent them out for weddings, and many of their titles still carry ceremonial weight, even if their political power has long since vanished. You lean back and reflect. In Britain, titles aren't just social markers. They're part of the architecture, like crown moulding and old wallpaper. Fussy, beautiful, occasionally peeling, but still very much there. You're reambling down a gravel road somewhere in southern Italy, when a rider gallops by and introduces himself as King of Naples. Before you can offer a polite nod, another rider pulls up, equally regal, equally confident, and says he is the true King of Naples, and then a third one shows up. Welcome to the ever-confusing world of pretenders, those charming, chaotic figures in history who claimed noble titles that may or may not have belonged to them. Pretenders were everywhere in Europe's tangled web of inheritance laws, dynastic marriages, and political upheaval. In some cases, they had a legitimate argument. In others, they were just really good at keeping a straight face while holding a fake scepter, and no region produced quite as many of them as the Italian peninsula. Naples alone saw more than its fair share between the French Angevins, the Spanish Bourbons, and various rebellious cousins. The throne passed hands like a very fancy game of musical chairs. You sip a bitter espresso at a roadside cafe as a local explains that during one particular century, no fewer than 4 different royal houses all claimed the Neapolitan crown, all with impressive-sounding full titles, all very annoyed at each other. Historians still argue whether some pretenders truly believed they had a divine writer, hoping their claim would stick if they said it loudly and often enough. You begin to understand that being a pretender wasn't always about deception. Sometimes it was about stubbornness, paperwork, and being born at just the wrong or right. Take Charles Edward Stuart, a Kappa Boni, Prince Charlie. He styled himself as King Charles III of England, Scotland, and Ireland, despite the small detail that he had zero actual power. But his supporters Jacobites treated him like royalty anyway. He even had his own court in exile, royal stationery, and a great wig. One fringe tidbit: he held mock court sessions where guests were expected to bow, address him as Your Majesty, and never bring up the fact that his kingdom existed mostly in pamphlets and tavern songs. And this wasn't unique to Britain. In France, after the Revolution chopped off some heads and scattered others across Europe, multiple noble families claimed to be the true royal line. The Bourbons, the The Bonaparte Seven, the Carlists in Spain, had cousins claiming rights to the French throne. Imagine a family reunion where every cousin insists they're the CEO and no one's invited to HR. These claimants held fast to their titles: King of France, Duke of Normandy, Prince of the Blood. Even as the world moved on, they were ghosts of a former order, clinging to the rituals, seals, and etiquette of long-dead courts. And here's where it gets extra complicated. Pretenders didn't just pretend they passed their claims on. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren inherited titles they never officially held. There are people today who still claim to be rightful kings or emperors of places that no longer exist. You glance at your phone and realize one of them is probably tweeting right now about legitimacy and the Treaty of Utrecht. Even stranger, these phantom titles still matter to some people. Orders of knighthood founded by pretenders like the Order of St. Michael of the Wing in Portugal are still awarded to this day. They're not legally recognized, but recipients treat them as honors of deep cultural value. Then there's the case of the Latin emperors of Constantinople. After the city fell in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade, a new line of emperors was crowned. When Constantinople was retaken in 1261, that imperial line was exiled but continued to claim the title for generations. Imagine being emperor of a city you've never been to, and getting very fussy when someone calls you anything less. One Austrian noble even styled himself as Emperor of the Romans and Guardian of the Imperial Womb. No one knows what that last part means. Maybe it sounded impressive in Latin. There were also paper princes, men who declared themselves rulers of micronations, extinct duchies or made-up kingdoms, and convinced hundreds of people to invest in land that turned out to be jungle and fever. Some even had supporters. A man in the 19th century claimed to be the Prince of Poitiers. He printed money, issued noble titles, and wore a royal sash. He was eventually imprisoned but never apologized. He considered himself a victim of insufficient imagination on the part of others. But not all pretenders were harmless. Some ignited real wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, that was basically a European brawl over who the better claim to the Spanish crown after the Habsburg king died heirless. It dragged in England, France, Austria, the Netherlands, and eventually led to treaties that rearranged the continent like furniture after a party. You can almost hear the argument. My cousin's nephew married your uncle's stepdaughter, which makes me king now. No, I married his aunt, which cancels out your claim. Check me. The scholarly term for all this noble drama is legitimist secession. But really, it was just a never-ending game of noble monopoly, and everyone wanted Boardwalk and Park Place even if they had to forge the deed. In many ways, pretenders were the living embodiment of how powerful a title could be, even without the castle, crown, or subjects, because a title, once claimed, had a peculiar kind of gravity. It pulled people in: supporters, enemies, poets, dreamers. You walk through a museum now and spot a velvet-lined chest containing a golden seal. It's labeled property of His Royal Highness, King John II of Jerusalem. You chuckle. Jerusalem had no King John II. But someone really wanted to believe otherwise. In the end, pretenders remind you that titles, like bedtime stories, don't need to be real to matter. They just need to be told with conviction and maybe a little silk embroidery. You're now wandering through a modest little principality tucked between towering mountains and a turquoise sea somewhere like Liechtenstein or Monaco, where the titles are short, the land is small, and the egos are still massive. Welcome to the world of micro-states and where even the tiniest patch of land can produce some of the longest, most elaborate, noble titles in history. At first glance, you might think, surely a place the size of a shopping mall doesn't need a full parade of dukes, princes, and grand marshals. But, oh, dear listener, you would be wrong. In places like Monaco, Andorra, or San Marino, the grandeur of titles isn't about territory, it's about tradition, diplomacy, and very old paperwork. Take Liechtenstein, for example. It's about 160 square kilometers of alpine postcard charm, and yet the head of state is styled His Serene Highness Reigning Prince of Liechtenstein, Duke of Trappau and Jagendorf, Count of Rietberg. That's quite the resume for someone ruling a country you could jog across before lunch. Historians still argue whether these titles were originally created to secure real influence, or simply handed out by larger empires to keep smaller nobles obedient and flattered. Either way, they stuck. Liechtenstein's ruling family didn't even live in the country for most of its early history. They acquired the land mainly because it allowed them to sit in the Imperial Council of the Holy Roman Empires, that title labyrinth from earlier. They bought the land, then bought a few more titles to match, and boom! Welcome to principality status. Then there's Monaco, a place so fancy even the seagulls look judgmental. Its ruler today is Albert II, Prince of Monaco. But that's just the casual version. He also holds the titles Duke of Valentinois, Marquis of Borks, Count of Baron of Saint-Lay, and Lord of Martillon, among others. That's a lot of flair for a place smaller than Central Park. But it wasn't always glitter and yacht parties. In the medieval period, Monaco was a fortress, a valuable stronghold caught between Genoa and France. The Grimaldi family, who still rule it today, took it by force, and then spent centuries securing papal, imperial, and French recognition of their princely status. Prince of Monaco, Lord of Menton and Roquebrune, defender of the faith, keeper of the maritime gateway. One fringe tidbit. The Grimaldis once issued proclamations under the grand title, "By the grace of God." That last bit sounds like something from a fantasy novel. You stroll into Andorra next, and things get even more curious. Andorra is ruled not by one prince, but two. One is the President of France. The other is the Bishop of Urgell in Spain. Yes, a secular head of state and a Catholic bishop sharing equal sovereignty over a country that mostly produces tax-free electronics and excellent hiking trails. It's like a buddy cop movie, where both officers wear ceremonial robes and sign treaties by quill pen. And defender of the valleys, even though he probably couldn't find Andorra on a map without GPS assistance. And the titles here get technical. The President of France is styled Co-Prince of Andorra, Count of. And then you have San Marino, one of the oldest republics in the world. Here, the heads of state are called Captains Regent, and they're elected every 6 months. No hereditary titles here, just rotating governance and enough ceremony to make a royal jealous. And yes, even these Captains Regent have honorific softened-styled excellency, sometimes the most serene, because even a rotating leadership wants a little gravitas. You begin to see a pattern. In the miniature realms of Europe, titles often served as shields. They were diplomatic armor signaling that we may be small, but we are not insignificant. The microstates knew they couldn't win wars, but they could win recognition, so they loaded up on the most ornate, ceremonial language possible. Because if your country doesn't have an army, it had better have an archive. One noble in the 19th century actually coined a personal title, Grand Constable of the Royal Order of the Azure Star of the Pyrenean Valleys. No one knew what it meant, but it impressed dinner guests, and that was half the point. Sometimes these tiny states even handed out noble titles like party favors. A struggling duke in the Italian Alps might sell a barony to a wealthy Swiss merchant. A remote monastery might elevate a visiting cardinal to principate. of the outer cloister in exchange for a new roof. This practice selling nobility was especially popular during financial crises. And let's be honest, most of these places had financial crises every few decades. Today, you can still find people holding titles like Count of Madroni or Baron of Glarus, legacies of long-defunct courts or one-time political bribes, a modern quirk. Some of these microstates have revived their noble orders as tourism and cultural tools. Monaco's Order of St. Charles still awards. San Marino hosts historical pageants in full regalia. Liechtenstein maintains royal weddings that make headlines and inspire jealous eyes from duchesses elsewhere. And don't forget Vatican City. Yes, the Pope rules it. And yes, the Church once handed out papal nobility titles: Prince, Assistant to the Papal Throne, Count of the Sacred Palace, Marchese di Roma. Many of those have faded, but some descendants still use the titles today, especially in ceremonial or diplomatic circles. In the end, these micronations prove that size isn't everything when it comes to nobility. Sometimes, a postage stamp-sized realm with a good tailor and a calligrapher can hold its own among empires, and when it comes to noble titles, they knew the secret. If you can't conquer your neighbors, out-title them. You find yourself ducking beneath the arched lintel of a gloomy stone hall, the kind that smells faintly of old vellum, wet wool, and inherited anxiety. This time, you're deep in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the titles weren't just long, they were practically geological in scale, layered over centuries like sedimentary rock. Here, noble titles weren't simply a matter of birth or war. They were expressions of bureaucracy. Entire ministries were devoted to cataloguing, preserving, and adjudicating who could call themselves what. And by the time you're halfway through reading someone's full honorific, your tea has gone cold. It wasn't enough to be a duke, a count, or a baron. You were likely all three simultaneously, and maybe also a landgrave, a knight commander, or hereditary cupbearer to the imperial table. Historians still argue whether the absurdly complex title system helped stabilize such a vast and diverse empire, or whether it simply created a social powder keg that exploded in slow motion. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't just Austria and Hungary. It was a quilt stitched together from Bohemia, Galicia, Croatia, Transylvania, parts of Italy, and a dozen other territories. And with every new edition came new titles, each with its own language, legal history, and ancient blood feuds. At the top sat the emperor, officially titled His Imperial and Royal Apostolic Majesty Franz Joseph. I, by the grace of God, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary and Bohemia, King of Jerusalem, Archduke of Austria, Grand Duke of Tuscany and Duke of Lorraine, Salzburg, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, and Bukovina, Grand Prince of Transylvania, Margrave of Moravia, Duke of Upper and Lower Silesia, Modena, Parma, Piacenza. That's just the beginning. The full version runs several hundred words. It was printed on imperial seals, coins, and occasionally pamphlets so dense they had their own paper. A fringe tidbit. One clerk once misspelled a duchy name in an official title list and caused a diplomatic incident that lasted 6 weeks. You shuffle past a gallery of oil portraits, most of them of Habsburg nobles, with 16 part names and expressions that scream, "I've worn a cravat since birth." These people didn't just inherit titles, they accumulated them like antiques. A Habsburg archduke might inherit 5 or 6 distinct duchies and be referred to by all of them in every formal setting. And while the Austrian half of the empire preferred the sleek grandeur of Germanic Friar first, the Hungarian side added its own twists. In Hungary, titles were often territorial. Count of Somogy, Baron of Borsod, Lord of, and the Lower Tisa, Sometimes these areas no longer even existed as distinct political entities, but they still sounded impressive, and that was what mattered. Even more delightful, Hungarian nobles often used Latinized versions of their names, so István Nagy might become Stephanus Magnus. Commas di Scalio Barelli. You don't speak Latin, but even you know that's a flex. The empire also awarded noble ranks to bureaucrat civil servants who served faithfully for decades, could be elevated to Edler, the lowest rank of nobility, and hosting dinner parties with just enough silver to signal that yes, they were somebody now. These men often came from humble origins, but they wore their new titles like Armerading von to their surnames, of course. Titles also depended heavily on language. The same man might be a Graf in Vienna, a in Budapest, and a Conte in Trieste. All technically meant count. But the nuances were important, because this wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a multilingual contest for prestige. One noble house even had 3 coats of arms, one for each part of the empire they ruled over. Their matter unity in titles. Unironically, you hear about noblewomen titled Reichsgräfin, first in Witwoud and Erindame des Sternkreuzordens, each title earned or inherited based on marriage, widowhood, or imperial favor. At one imperial ball, the empress reportedly refused to dance with a duchess because she had only 5 generations of nobility. Scandalous. There were also titular titles, completely honorary ranks with no lands attached. These were often handed out like gold stars to distant cousins or loyal diplomats. You meet a man who introduces himself as Prince Bishop Emeritus, honorary knight of the Golden Fleece, and second cousin to the Archduchies of Inner Corinth. He sells umbrellas now, but still never refer to him without the Prince Bishop part. He will correct you mid-handshake. And let's not forget about orders and decorations. The Austro-Hungarian Empire adored medals. There were orders of the Iron Crown, St. Stephen, Leopold, Maria Theresa. Each came with its own ribbon, sash, and you guessed it's more titles. A man might be styled Foreign Affairs Secretary, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Iron Crown, Commander of the Military Order of Maria Theresa, and Bearer of the Cross of Civic Merit. His actual job, but he looked like a general. And sometimes that's enough. You finally reach the Imperial Archives, a vast room lined with scrolls and glass cases. Each document is handwritten in Gothic script, so elaborate it looks like it's daring you to read it. A few titles leap out at you. Baron of the Windy Fields, Hereditary, Falconer of Transdanubia, High Protector of the Imperial Inkstand. You wonder if the last one was a joke? It wasn't. The Habsburgs ran their empire like a performance, and in a performance, everyone needs a costume and a role. Even if that role is third cupbearer to the archducal breakfast, it's all incredibly inefficient, but also kind of beautiful. You realize these titles weren't just political tools. They were ways of organizing chaos, ways of remembering who you were, and who your great-great-grandmother was, and why she once owned an entire village, because she sent the emperor a rare dog. By the end of the day, your brain is foggy with counts and margraves and minor princelings of forgotten lakeside regions. But one thing's clear, no one did titles like the It was empire by admin, prestige by punctuation, and somehow it worked. You're now pacing through a chilly stone corridor in a fortress perched high in the Carpathians. The fire in the hearth is low, the air smells like damp parchment and candle wax, and someone just handed you a formal invitation addressed to His Illustrious Excellency, Voivode of the Eastern Slopes, Guardian of the Danubian Crossroads, Lord of the Great Oak Province, Defender of the Faithful Peasants, and Bearer of the Bronze Wolf. You turn to the steward and ask, So, is he a duke? The steward chuckles. No, he says. Ah, of course. And starists and the chain of command often depended less on royal decree than on whoever had the most mustaches in their family portrait. But what is certain is that Eastern and Southeastern Europe produced some of the most eccentric and colourful noble roles on the continent. Welcome to the Slavic world of title oddities, a sprawling realm where nobles, warranty always counts, or dukes, but boyars, voivodes. Historians still argue whether Slavic title structures were more egalitarian or just confusing in a more rustic, embroidered kind of way. Let's start with a Slavic military leader turned regional governor. The voivode was basically a warlord with stationery. The title pops up across Wallachia, Moldavia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and even parts of Poland and Hungary. You might recognize the most infamous voivode of all time, Vlad III of Wallachia. You know him as Dracula. His full title: Voivode Vlad, son of the dragon, ruler of the mountains and forests, lord of the a little intense for a business card, but the title itself, Voivode, carried both military and administrative power. It wasn't hereditary at first, but over time, like everything noble, it got passed down and wrapped in family drama. Then we have boyarsta, power players of medieval Russia and Eastern Europe. Boyars weren't your average nobles. They were magnates, high-ranking aristocrats who often held more land, wealth, and grudges than the monarch himself. One fringe tidbit. In 17th century Russia, boyars refused to shave their beards, even when Peter the Great made it a law. Some opted to pay a beard tax instead, proudly displaying medallions that read, "This beard has been taxed." You picture a room full of scowling, bearded boyars, and think, not a group you'd want to challenge to a staring contest. The boyars were so powerful that the Tsar of Russia often had to walk a tightrope to keep them loyal. They could form powerful blocks, manipulate succession, or just sulk so effectively that national reforms stalled for decades. But Russia wasn't the only land with unique, noble roles. In Poland and Lithuania, we encounter the Szlachtier noble class that technically included up to 10% of the male population. Yes, you heard that right. Poland had more nobles per capita than just about anywhere else in Europe, and with that came a staggering array of titles, many of which had more to do with influence and election rights than with land or military service. The most iconic among these, the hetmana, noble general, who often wielded as much power as the king, especially during wartime. There were even great hetmans and field hetmans, just to keep the hierarchy properly baffling. You step into a dim room with crossed halberds on the wall and a faded banner reading, "By the will of the nobility, I ride for freedom and garlic prices." You don't ask. In the Balkans, titles were even more eclectic. There were Nezes, Banavi, and Despasies. That was an actual title, not just a warning label. A Serbian despot was a legitimate high-ranking title derived from Byzantine influence, often granted to regional rulers with close ties to Constantinople. Imagine introducing yourself at a banquet. "Good evening, I'm Despot Ivan." No relation to the emotional damage you're thinking of. And then there were staris, essentially town or district overseers, who often doubled as tax collectors, local judges, and part-time bribe experts. Their role varied wildly depending on the region and century, but many were known for their eccentric interpretations of law and devotion to maintaining elaborate seals for stamping anything that looked remotely official. One starist famously signed his name with a wax imprint of a squirrel holding a sword. It became his trademark. But things didn't stop at native Slavic titles. The reach of the Habsburgs and Ottomans introduced foreign honors into Slavic noble culture, so you might find someone styled Baron von Sambor, Starost of Imperial Knight of the Golden Apple, and Steward of the Fourth Vineyard. One title from Austria, one from Hungary, one from local tradition, and one for his wine collection. And remember, many of these titles coexisted simultaneously in the same region, so a single man might be a Bojar in practice, a baron on paper, and a hetman in battle. You'd need a genealogist, a cartographer, and an exorcist to untangle it all. But why so many titles? Because in the politically fragmented, culturally diverse lands of Eastern Europe, titles were a way to balance power. If you couldn't be king, you could still be something. And if your neighbor got a fancy promotion, you could invent a title of your own to keep up appearances. It was title inflation, but with more embroidered waistcoats. Even today, echoes of these roles survive in honorary societies, folkloric festivals, and dusty family Bibles full of noble seals. You meet a man who tells you, quite seriously, that he is the rightful voivode of the lower forests. He runs a shoe repair shop. But hey, nobility is a state of mind. As you step back outside into the cold air, you realize these titles weren't just functional. They were storytelling devices, part legal role, part myth. Because in the Slavic world, your title wasn't just who you were, it was how you survived. You find yourself now seated beneath the grand chandelier of a Baroque dining hall in a German principality so obscure you have to squint at the name on the crest just to pronounce it. Welcome to the realm of Holy Roman title soup, where every noble family seemed to have invented at least 2 new ranks, just in case. You sip from a porcelain teacup painted with a griffin playing a lute, and realize you're re-deep inside the most delightfully bureaucratic empire in European history. The Holy Roman Empire, neither holy, nor Roman, nor much of an empire. As Voltaire famously said, was a sprawling, decentralized mess of kingdoms, duchies, prince-bishoprics, free cities, and abbeys. And each of them had titles, many, many titles. Historians still argue whether this title inflation was a reflection of decentralized power, or simply the product of competitive ceremony gone wild. Because in the Holy Roman world, if you didn't have a duchy or a margraviate, and if you couldn't be a king, you could at least be a Reichsfürsten imperial prince, with voting rights at the Diet. The most important players in this noble soup were the prince-electors or originally 7. Later expanded, they were the elite nobles tasked with electing the Holy Roman Emperor. They included the kings of Bohemia, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and several secular rulers like the Margrave of Brandenburg, and each one had a ceremonial job attached. The Elector of Saxony, for example, was the Archmarshal of the Empire. Another was the Archsteward. You imagine a glittering imperial court where one man bangs a golden ladle on the floor to signal desert. Titles here weren't just inherited, they were layered. So a single noble might be His High Princely Grace, George Leopold, Reichsfürst of Altdorf, Margrave of the Upper Elbe, Count Palatine of the Red Hills, an imperial cupbearer of the Western Marshes. You reach for your notepad and give up halfway through. One fringe tidbit. The office of Imperial Archchamberlain was once claimed by 2 rival families at the same coronation. The resulting scuffle delayed the ceremony by 6 hours and reportedly involved some light swordplay near the desert table. In this world, counts weren't just counts. There were Grafen and Landgrafen, each with different privileges, precedents, and seating arrangements at banquets. If that wasn't enough, some titles included multiple geographic labels, even if the lands themselves were just forests, hills, or strategically located cow pastures, like Freiherr von Anjou, Lichtenberg, AMC and Hinterholzwich. roughly translates to free. Lord from and to Lichtenberg on the lake and behind the woods. Some of these nobles ruled actual territories. Others merely held titular authority over symbolic or historic places, long lost to war or marriage pacts, and if your lands got absorbed or overrun, no problem. The emperor might upgrade your title anyway, because nobility here was about standing, not function. There is an open debate among historians about whether the Holy Roman title system ever had a clear hierarchy, or whether it was more like a feudal family potluck, where everyone brought their own dishes and name. You peek at a preserved parchment labeled Patent of Nobility granted to Johann Franz, Imperial Falconer and bearer of the Silver Pickle. Sure, why not? One of the stranger offices belonged to the prince-bishop's clerics, who not only held religious power but also governed secular principalities. A man might simultaneously be a bishop, a count, a prince, and a knight in 3 chivalric orders. There's a painting of one such man standing stiffly in his bishop's mitre, a sword on one hip, a crosier on the other, and what appears to be a falcon perched on his shoulder, multitasking at its finest. Then you have the mediatized houses families, that once ruled sovereign states, but were folded into larger kingdoms after Napoleon's restructuring of Europe. These houses kept their titles, and were often referred to as high nobility even though their power was purely ceremonial by the 19th century. They still got invited to imperial weddings. They still demanded precedence over mere counts. And yes, they still handed out family titles, like party favors. Imagine a family tree where each branch is labeled with something like Prince of the Third Line, non-ruling cadet of the Southern Palatinate, guardian of the Swan Crest, holder of the Lesser Horn. You'd need a medieval legal team just to draft an RSVP. And speaking of RSVP, marriage in these circles was its own title-producing machine. When noble houses intermarried, their children sometimes inherited not 1, not 2, but dozens of titles. You glance at a genealogical record and read Maria Theresia Leopoldina Honor, Duchess of Württemberg by maternal line, Countess of St. Wittgenstein via paternal descent, Marchioness of Shanborn by marriage, and hereditary beer mistress of the Black Forest. That's a job title with potential, but there's one element of the Holy Roman title system that really pushes things over the edge. Noble prefixes and connectors. You see a man introduced as Herr Frederick von und du Owenberg, and you wonder, why the von and the zu? Turns out, von means of, as in from the family of, while zu means at or resident of, so von und zu suggests noble heritage and continued residence, a humble brag, baked into the grammar, and was used when your actual name was too common to impress. Some nobles insisted on using von dem zum zu, or even Gänent, which means called example, Baron Franz Gänent, meaning Baron Franz, called Eisenbart. Nicknames, but with ceremony. You leave the dining hall now, thoroughly over. Titles weren't just social markers. Here they were survival tools in a decentralized empire full of shifting alleys. A well-placed margraviate might shield your family for generations. A cleverly inherited bishopric might provide both land and divine immunity. The Holy Roman Empire may be long gone, but its titles live on tombstones, in family crests, and in German language Wikipedia entries longer than the Rhine. And as you close the gilded door behind you, you realize something simple, silly, and profound. In this empire, you weren't someone unless you were something, preferably something ending in Groff, Herr, or Marshal of the Feathered Council. You're standing now at the wind-swept edge of a craggy Scottish moor, where the fog rolls in like a silent army, and the bagpipes echo faintly through the hills. Here in the Highlands and Isles, titles weren't just about rank, they were about clan. Forget continental dukes and princes for a moment. This was a world where being McSomething of somewhere could command as much respect, and occasionally as much fear as any coroneted noble. Welcome to the realm of clan chiefs, lairds, and Highland. The noble system in Scotland didn't always mirror England's rigid feudal structure. Instead, it fused land ownership, lineage, and legacy into a sprawling tapestry of identity. And it all began with the chiefs. A clan chief was the recognized head of a great family group. Not always a lord in the English sense, but powerful nonetheless. They were protectors, judges, war leaders, and, sometimes, excellent cattle thieves. You're handed a formal introduction letter, wax-sealed and hand-scripted, addressed to the Right Honourable Angus MacLeod, 32nd Chief of the Clan MacLeod, Baron of Denvegan, Keeper of the Fairy Flag, and Hereditary Taxman of the Quillen Ridge. You nod. That'll do. One fringe tidbit. That fairy flag is real. It's a tattered silk banner kept at Denvegan Castle, set to bring victory in battle and protection from plague. Historians still argue whether it was a medieval war token or a cleverly preserved scrap of Eastern cloth mistaken for magical linen. What's clear is this. In the Scottish system, stories were currency. Titles were often wrapped in legend, reinforced by folklore, and passed along with an oral nod and a slightly suspicious glint in the eye. The word laird might sound quaint now, but it was no small matter. A laird was a landowner specifically, one who held a feudal estate known as a few. It was akin to lord, but used differently. Lairds were not peers of the realm, but they had local power, deference, and crucially land. If you owned a chunk of territory, you might be called the Laird of Glenwisk, even if Glenwiskers was just a damp valley with 6 sheep and 1 determined goat. The title Laird was often hereditary, though not always. Sometimes, ambitious merchants or military men bought their way into the position, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, when land sales surged after the Highland clearances. This created tension. Old families with lineage and law versus new lairds with bank accounts and British Army pensions. You hear whispers of a well-documented spat in the 1800s when a Glasgow soap tycoon bought an estate and titled himself the Laird of Loch Gruinard. The locals replied by calling him the Bubble Baron. In the Scottish peerage, you also had official noble ranks, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, but they didn't always wield the same grassroots respect as the clan heads. A Duke of Argyll might hold high court, but the chief of Clan Campbell could summon hundreds of armed men with a single horn blast. And yes, many Scottish nobles did hold both roles. One of the quirkiest titles, High Admiral of the Western Isles, bestowed on a Highland lord known more for his boat-burning antics than his seafaring skills. Legend says he once declared war on a rival by setting fire to every wooden structure within sight, his own, barns included. You stroll past the ruins of a keep, once ruled by a Thenan, old term for a nobleman that predated the more standardized peerage titles. Shakespeare made it famous in Macbeth. Thane of Cawdor, but real thanes were local rulers appointed by kings, often with semi-autonomous power. Think of them as regional managers with axes. And what about those colourful tartans? Each major clan had its own. Wearing the wrong one could start a brawl. Wearing none at all, even worse. Tartans weren't just fashion, they were territorial branding. One scholarly debate centers around whether tartans were really that standardized before the 18th century, or if most of what we think of as ancient clan patterns were actually post-Jacobite embellishments. Speaking of Jacobites, many Highland chiefs supported the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745. fighting for the return of the exiled Stuart monarchy. After the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the British government cracked down hard. Kilts, clan gatherings, and even the speaking of Gaelic were restricted. Many chiefs lost lands, and the noble network in the Highlands began to fracture. Still, the titles endured. Even today, Scotland has a Lord Lion King of Arms, an official who oversees matters of heraldry and title recognition. If you want to be legally acknowledged as a clan chief, you go through Lord Lion. He has robes, he has authority, he has excellent handwriting. You check the local registry and find dozens of titles still in use. MacGregor of MacGregor, Fraser of Lovett, the Menzies of Menzies, MacDonald of Sleat, Chief of Clan Donald South. These are not just honorary names. They're tied to lineages, lands, and cultural preservation efforts. A modern quirk. Today, some websites sell novelty plots of land in Scotland with laird certificates attached. They're usually just souvenir-sized patches, but they've launched thousands of hopeful title claims. You meet a man who insists he's the Laird of Seagull Rock. You nod respectfully. He's wearing But here's the thing. In Scotland, nobility has always danced on the line between folklore and feudalism. And it's that blend, the kilted mythos mixed with blood-bound reality, that makes it so compelling. Because in this landscape of mist and memory, a name still means something, and a title, even if partly stitched together by legend, still carries the weight of granite hills and clan banners caught in the wind. Now, you drift south through the misty folds of Europe into the sun-drenched hills of Spain and Portugal, where noble titles come wrapped in gold, garlic, and deeply Catholic ceremony. But make no mistake, just because the wine is good and the architecture romantic docenti mean, the noble system here was simple. In fact, Iberian aristocracy may have written the most melodramatic chapter in the Book of Noble Complexity. You're handed a heavy vellum envelope tied with red silk cord. The front reads, "To His Excellency Don Ignacio de la Torre Montemayor Eri, 9th Duke of Villahermosa, Grandee of Spain, Marquis of La Sierra Alta, Count of the Sacred Tree, Knight of Santiago, Lord of the Olive Domain, and Protector of the Fourfold Altar. You exhale." That's not an amateur history exam. Let's start with Spain's unique contribution to noble excess. The Grandee of Spain. Grandees weren't just high-ranking nobles. They were super nobles, people who, by law and tradition, could remain seated and covered in the presence of the king. Historians still argue whether this was a real show of status, or just a polite way to acknowledge that Spanish noble fashion involved heavy headgear and fainting was a risk. Grandees had precedence over other nobles, carried specific honors at court, and often held multiple titles at once. Many grandees were also dukes, marquesses, and in Spain, it was very common for a single person to hold a dozen or more hereditary titles. In fact, one 20th century Spanish duchess, Doña Cayetana Fitzjames Stewart, held over 50 noble titles, including Duchess of Alba, Marchioness of Carpio, Countess of Montijo, Duchess of Liria, and Countess, Duchess of Olivar. She had so many names, she once quipped that her passport couldn't contain them. Her full official name ran over 30 words. One fringe tidbit: she was also the only person in Spain legally permitted to ride a horse through Seville Cathedral, just in case she got bored at Sunday Mass. But Iberian titles weren't just for show. They were steeped in Catholic symbolism and military legacy, especially due to the long centuries of the Reconquista, Christian effort to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Noble families who fought in these campaigns were often rewarded with new lands and ornate titles like Protector of the Sacred Crossroads, Knight of the Burning Lance, or Count of the Seven Moors Hills. These weren't just poetic, they were living reminders of bloodlines that had earned their nobility through combat, devotion, and timely alliances. You pass through the oak-panelled library of a Galician palace and find a shelf full of dusty registers, each meticulously listing titles such as Viscount of the Blessed Shore, Lord of the Almond Wall, Marquis of the Five Blessed Candles. One can't help but wonder, were these names meant to impress or confuse? A modern scholarly debate still simmers over how many of these titles were actively used, versus how many were simply kept as ceremonial trophies. But even symbolic titles held power, particularly in marriage, inheritance, and court proceedings. And speaking of names, Spain's naming system often preserves both paternal and maternal surnames. So if a noble father is Don de los, why Castillo, and the noble mother is Dona Mariana, their child might be named Don Felipe de los Rios, Ortega de Ayala y Castillejo, 11th Marquis of Benavent. Its lesser name and more a family reunion. Portugal followed a similar noble trajectory, but with its own unique features. Portuguese nobles held titles like Conde Viscon and Marquis, and many were deeply tied to colonial history. Unlike much of Europe, Portugal's nobility extended across oceans. You could be Count of Goa, Baron of Maranhão, or Viscount of Mozambique, attached to far-flung colonial territories that existed more on maps than in daily governance. One curious practice: Portuguese monarchs often issued noble titles with poetic and nature-infused names. So you'd find titles like Count of the Palm Grove, Baron of the Four Rivers, Knight of the Distant Wind. You picture a nobleman giving that last one at a party and everyone nodding respectfully while having no idea what it means. In both Spain and Portugal, military religious orders also handed out titles. The Order of Santiago, Order of Calatrava, an order of weren't just knightly clubs. They were serious power players, and their leadership came with major landholdings, social prestige, and noble titles. You glance at an old medal inscribed, To Don Alvaro, Commander of the Order of Christ, Defender of the Nine Lanterns. Sure, why not? In Iberia, titles were also deeply ceremonial, but as legal identities, often tied to vast estates, foundations, and heritage trusts. You might have to perform certain rituals at royal baptisms, maintain a chapel, or light a particular candelabra on a saint's feast day. One noble house in Valencia still performs an annual goat blessing ritual, an obligation tied to an obscure 15th century title, Lord of the Windy Hill and Keeper of the Blessed Herd. Even as the political power of nobles declined in the 19th and 20th centuries, the titles remain not as military commands. And unlike in Britain, where most peerages passed through the male line, Spain allowed for more flexible succession laws. Women often inherited noble titles outright. This has created some modern oddities. Today, a young woman might simultaneously be the 22nd Marchioness of Fuenteva, 10th Countess of Los Rosas, and 7th Duchess of San Miguel. You meet one such title holder on a tour of her family's ancestral home. She's wearing jeans and pouring you sangria from a recycled jar. When you call her Your Grace, she laughs and says, "Oh please, I just go by." But you noticed she still signs her emails with the full string of titles, just in case. Because in Spain and Portugal, nobility was never just about power. It was about memory, ritual, and a deep connection to land, saints, and stories. Titles here weren't just bestowed. They were lived, often with pride, sometimes with irony, and always with just enough syllables to slow down anyone in a hurry. Now you find yourself on the winding steps of a French chateau. The kind with ivy crawling up limestone walls and peacocks patrolling the gravel driveway like they own the place, which, given the title history around here, they might. This is France, where nobility was equal parts powdered wig, political chess, and existential dread, especially if your name happened to be on the wrong list during the revolution. Here, titles weren't just ranks, they were weapons, warnings, and occasionally very fancy alibis. France had all the usual suspects, dukes, marquises, but it also had a unique blend of court etiquette, legal nuance, and inherited performance that made the French nobility both dazzling and exhausting. Historians still argue whether the French peerage system was the most structured in Europe or just the best dressed. Let's begin with the Duke of France, a title once held by the Capetian kings before they even became kings. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the title of Duc had evolved into a high courtly rank, often granted by royal favor. But there were layers. You could be a Duc à brevet, which meant your title didn't pass on to your children, or a Duc, which meant you belonged to the elite club of 12 peers who had ceremonial precedence second only to royalty, like the Duc de Saint-Simon, famous not just for his lineage, but for his gossipy, wonderfully judgmental memoirs about life at Versailles. And then there were the Marquis. Theoretically, a Marquis governed a march, or borderland territory. In reality, by the 18th century, they mostly governed conversation starters. One fringe tidbit. The infamous Marquis de Sade held a marquisate so minor and detriden that it is unlikely he ever governed more than a few irritated creditors and a suspicious housekeeper. And yet, the title stuck, because French titles were as much about style as they were about function. The Count was the most common mid-tier title, often used by nobles with real landholdings, small armies, or just enough silverware to outshine the neighbors. Below that, you had the Vicomte or Viscount, and the Baron. You passed through a hallway lined with oil portraits bearing titles like Comte de Vicomte, de Vicomte, de Vicomte, du V. You pause at one, Chevalier de la Lune, or Knight of the Moon, a poetic name and possibly a warning. Chevalier was another common title, especially for younger sons of noble houses. It meant knight. But in France, it didn't always imply military service. Sometimes it meant court duties. Other times just a charming wardrobe and enough fencing skill to stay alive during duels. Which brings us to one of the stranger features of French nobility. Noblesse de robe versus noblesse de. The noblesse dependability of the sword were the old warrior aristocracy, descended from feudal lords, knights, and crusaders. They were proud, dramatic, and occasionally broke. The noblesse de robe nobility of the robe were those who bought or earned their titles through judicial or bureaucratic service. They wore long robes, signed official papers, and were sometimes richer than their sword-swinging cousins. You overhear a barbed comment at a phantom dinner party. He's a count of the pen, not the blade. OOF. By the 17th century, the sale of titles had become a full-on business. A wealthy merchant could buy the office of Armort-Ayah, which conferred nobility after a few generations, and his great-grandchildren were vicomtes, probably with powdered wigs and opinions on lace trim. But not all titles were equal. France had a legal distinction between noblesse and noblesse, authentic nobility versus incomplete or questionable claims. Some families spent decades in court trying to prove they were real nobles. Others faked family trees, bought forged patents, or bribed archivists. One famous court case involved a man who claimed to be the Baron of the Whispering Forest, only to be exposed as the son of a wine merchant from Lyon. he was promptly renamed Baron du Grape and of course, all of this got blown apart by the French Revolution. In 1789, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges, titles were stripped, lands confiscated, and many nobles, particularly the richest and most visible, met their end beneath the guillotine. But here's the twist. Many titles came back. Under Napoleon, noble titles were reintroduced, this time with a military and administrative flair. Napoleon created his own peerage system, complete with counts of the empire, barons of the legion, and even a few princes. These new titles were earned on the battlefield or through loyal service to the regime, not ancient bloodlines. It caused considerable drama. "At least I earned my title with cannon fire," old nobles sneered at these newcomers. The new nobles sneered right back, clutching their medals and saying things like, "Even today, French noble titles aren't legally recognized. But they're not outlawed either. They live on in surnames, family traditions, dusty heraldry societies, and highly specific who's who registries." You find a glossy catalogue in a modern bookshop titled Amana de Gotha, Nobles de France et. Yes, that's still a thing. Some current title holders use their nobility in social events, philanthropic circles, or tourism. You meet a countess who runs a vineyard and signs her wine labels. By appointment to the descendant of the Conques de Villars. It's not official, but it sells. Because in France, titles today are echoes of battles, salons, estates, and revolutions. They're not about power anymore, they're about legacy. And as you leave the chateau, the scent of lavender and waxed parquet floor fading behind you, you realize something French nobility has always known. A title may not guarantee your survival, but it does make your fall far more dramatic. Now picture yourself strolling through the manicured grounds of a Georgian manor, where the hedges are symmetrical, the tea is just slightly oversteeped, and someone with 5 surnames is correcting your pronunciation of Viscount. Yes, you've arrived in Britain, where titles are serious business. Precedence charts are longer than most novels, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important than knowing where you stand in line for the buffet at a garden party. British nobility is perhaps the most famously structured in Europe. It has rules. It has protocols. It has enough footnotes to merit its own encyclopedia. And it all starts at the top. Technically, the monarch is the fountain of honor, the source from which all peerages flow. Whether you're an ancient duke or a newly minted baroness, your title ultimately derives from the crown. And the peerage system itself, well, that's a 5-tier cake. From highest to lowest, duke, duchess, marquis, viscountess, baron. Baroness, there's also a 6th level baronet, but don't get them confused with barons. Baronets are hereditary knights, not peers, and yes, people do care about the distinction. The British love their titles like they love their tea. Hot, carefully prepared, and with unspoken rules about how to stir it. You are now handed a letter addressed to the most noble Charles Arthur Pembroke Tyrrell, Marquis of Calverley, Earl of Southbridge, Viscount Wexley, Baron Mellington of Northumbria, and hereditary master of the Royal Kennels. That last one, still hotly contested. One mainstream fact: the British peerage is divided into 5 historic groups based on Scotland, Ireland, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom, each with its own quirks. So, a lord in Scotland might have different inheritance rules than a lord in England, even if both are wearing identical tweed. Now, here's a fringe tidbit. The only British peerage title that guarantees a coronation roll is Duke of Norfolk, who serves as Earl Marshal of England. He organizes coronations, state funerals, and large-scale ceremonial logistics. basically acting as the world's most aristocratic event planner. You'll picture him checking floral arrangements and whispering, "No, no King Edward used hyacinth." Some titles are extremely old, think Duke of Cornwall, while others were created as recently as the 21st century. For example, when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was granted a life peerage in 1992, she became Baroness Thatcher of Kestevan. Wait, life peerage? Ah, yes, life peers are distinctly modern British invention. While traditional peerages pass down to heirs, life peerages end with the title. They've been awarded since 1958 and are often given to former politicians, judges, scientists, or people who spent an impressive number of years telling the BBC what is wrong with things. Today, the House of Lords is a mix of hereditary peers, life peers, and a few bishops tossed in for good measure. It's a chamber of slow reform, velvet robes, and impressively dry speeches. You attend a session and overhear, "My lords, I rise to object, not to the motion, but to the motion of objection. To the motion's prior objection." You fall asleep halfway through. Meanwhile, titles in daily life vary in usage. A duke is addressed as Your Grace. A marquis, earl, viscount, or baron is called Lord Title, and their wives are Lady Title. First name, daughters, Lady First Name, and everyone else just kind of figures it out from context. The children of peers get their own courtesy. Titled sons of dukes and marquises may be called lord. One scholarly debate still ongoing. Should modern Britain abolish hereditary peerages entirely? Supporters say they're outdated. Traditionalists argue they're part of the cultural fabric. And in between, there are the people who bought a square foot of Scottish land online and now insist they re-legally laird Kevin. Of course, one of Britain's oldest noble quirks is the use of subsidiary titles. Let's say you're a duke. That often means you also hold lower titles like Marquis, Earl, and Baronet at the same time. So, if you're the Duke of Cavendish, your heir might go by Marquis of something, and his son might be Viscount something else. It's like a generational ladder built entirely out of velvet and hyphenated And about those surnames, British nobility loves a good double-barreled name. You've got the Howards, the Montague Douglases, the Temple Nugents, and the eternally confused Rutherford, who once accidentally sent a dinner invitation to themselves. These compound names often reflect marriages between noble houses and oligarchs, solution to inheritance squabbles and property consolidation, or sometimes it's just about sounding fancy. You're introduced to Lady Cordelia, Plumbridge Chesterton, and immediately feel underdressed. But titles aren't always ancient. Some are created by the Crown to reward military service, public work, or cultural contributions. That's how people like Sir David Attenborough, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, Lord Sugar joined the long line of titled Brits. And don't forget, knighthood's titles awarded for service to the nation. A knight is addressed as Sir First Name. Her husband shrugs and says, "But here's a twist. Their wives become Lady Lastnam, while their husbands receive absolutely nothing." A detail still raising eyebrows. You meet Dame Evelyn, a decorated scientist. "I suppose I'm just the luggage." Noble titles in Britain are full of quirks, contradictions, and century-spanning etiquette. They've outlived revolutions, reforms, and at least 5 styles of wallpaper. And today, they remain a part of the British psychoven into Parliament, woven into the tabloids, woven into the oddly formal tone of wedding invitations. Because here, nobility isn't just status. It's stagecraft, performed in slow motion, with a top hat and a knowing wink. You descend now into the marble halls of memory, where forgotten titles echo like distant footsteps on cold stone. This final leg of your noble journey takes you to the edgister dusty corridors of faded family trees, the footnotes of fading glory, and the strange titles that history misplaced. Because while the Grand Dukes and Barons fill history books, there exists an entire underworld of nobility so obscure, so oddly specific, they almost feel made up. But they weren't, and some still aren't. You find yourself seated at a long table in a Central European manor where the wallpaper is peeling, the chandelier flickers, and the elderly host introduces himself as the Right Honourable Sigismund von Lick, Lord of the Lower Maslands, Count of the 12th Timbermark, an unofficial patron of the abandoned well. He says this with such confidence, you hesitate to ask if 12th Timbermark is a real place. You realize, in many parts of the world, especially Central and Eastern Europe, noble titles continue to proliferate long after the states they were attached to dissolve. Historians still argue whether these phantom titles reflect nostalgia, vanity, or a very real effort to preserve heritage across collapse, conquest, and changing borders. Take Poland, for example. Before it was partitioned in the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had hundreds of noble families, called Slochdomani of them, with Latin-style coats of arms and very old bloodlines. But Poland had no formal peerage system like France or Britain. All Schlochter were theoretically equal whether they owned a massive estate or just a soggy field. Still, families took on grand styles, often using multiple surnames, heraldic symbols, and invented titles such as Guardian of the Southern March, Protector of the Meadow Bell, Knight of the White Boar. One fringe tidbit: some nobles used the same coat of arms as dozens of unrelated families, simply because heraldry in Poland worked more like tribal affiliation than individual identity. You glance at a scroll. A knight holding a radish above a flaming cauldron. Could be symbolic, could be lunch. In the Balkans, noble titles got even more complicated. As the Ottoman Empire swept through the region, many former noble houses retained their Christian titles, even while technically becoming Ottoman subjects. A Serbian noble might be called Vojvoda, while a Croatian count might swear allegiance to a distant Habsburg ruler, but still run his estate like an independent feud. After World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and suddenly, thousands of noble titles became functionally meaningless, but culturally persistent. That's where things get really weird. In interwar Hungary, you had entire genealogical societies dedicated to verifying claims of barony. In the Czech lands, you had old counts working as accountants, quietly correcting people when they mispronounced Graf. You meet a man named Baron Yanek of the Snowed Bridge, mostly. In Russia, after the revolution of 1917, the nobility was officially abolished. He lives in a 3-room apartment above a bakery and insists his great-grandfather once owned a castle. You believe him? The Soviet era, of course, tried to stamp this all out, and yet some titles survived underground. Exiled Russian nobles continued using them abroad, gathering in émigré communities in Paris, London, and New York. You find a 1930s letter from Princess Olga of Novgorod, inviting guests to a tea dance in Prague. It's signed in lavender ink, with a wax seal shaped like a startled goose. Even outside of Europe, noble titles flourished in strange ways. In Ethiopia, for instance, you had a well-defined aristocracy under Emperor Haile, with titles like Ras, Dija. Many of these were abolished after the 1974 revolution, but descendants still use them informally. In India, under the British Raj, the empire recognized hundreds of Maharajas, Nawabs, and Rajas, many of whom ruled semi-autonomous princely states. Titles like Raja of Pudukkottai. They had palaces, armies, tax systems, and enough elephants to start a traffic jam. Nawab of Bahawalpur, Maharaj of Alwar were more than ceremonial. Post-independence, these titles were officially dissolved, but some families kept the names, using them in business, tourism, and cultural preservation. Uttor, a palace-owned hotel in Rajasthan, hosted by His Highness, the 17th Maharaj of Ni. He serves you tea and shows you the family sword. It's heavier than expected. There are even micronations today that hand out their own titles. The Principality of Sealand, a seafort off the coast of England, Sayers, a self-declared Prince of Hutt River in Australia, gave himself a dukedom before the government reminded him that was not, in fact, how titles work. And still people buy them, because noble titles, real or fictional, still carry something. Cozy, a sense of order, a feeling that somewhere, deep in the archives of the world, your name might still be followed by a comma and a string of improbable syllables. Modern debates swirl around whether to maintain these titles. Some countries protect them legally, others ignore them, and a few outright ban their use in public. And yet genealogy sites flourish, family crests are commissioned, wedding invitations are printed with Lord and Lady in gold leaf, even if it is just a nod to a great-great-grandfather who once may have misled a census taker, and a certificate there's something undeniably human about wanting your name to echo just a little longer. Linguistic jewelry, little stories wrapped in velvet and dust, because the truth is, titles may have lost their armies. As the weight of velvet titles and forgotten honorifics begins to soften, you feel the centuries growing quiet around you, smiled at powdered wigs, and blinked at barons who may or may not have been real. But they haven't lost their charm, their heirlooms, and whether you're a real duke, a fake baron, or just someone who once bought a Lord of the Manor title online for $29.99, even if it's just down the hall of your own imagination, and now, not just for power, but for presents. The dust settles on long banquet tables, the gold-threaded banners droop ever so slightly, and the names, oh, all those grand and tangled names, whisper themselves into stillness. You've wandered through palaces and ruined castles, crossed borders and decades. You've seen titles that roared from the battlefield and others that fluttered out of nothing more than courtly flattery and a good tailor. And somehow, through all the ceremony and contradiction, a gentle truth remains. Soft velvet under your fingertips, that people ordinary breathing, dreaming, people created these elaborate hierarchies not just to govern, but to belong, to mean something, to be remembered. The Viscounts, the Lairds, the Grandee of Spain with his 17 surnames and his horse inside the cathedral bay, all carved out little niches in history. And as you drift further now into calm, let that presence fade into a blur of warm candlelight, a long corridor, a brass nameplate on a heavy oak door, quietly proclaiming, "The keeper of the quiet things." There's no need to knock. You've earned your place tonight, so breathe deep, relax your shoulders, and let those stories sleep beside you now. Because, in the end, no matter the title, everyone deserves a peaceful ending. Sweet dreams, gentle listener, you did well to make it this far.